Welcome to Reclaiming Home, a podcast focused on delivering thoughtful conversation and tangible actions to make housing justice a reality in our communities. I'm your host, Asale Sol Young, Executive Director of Urban Homeworks, an educator, activist, and proud Turtle Papa. I'm a Black Legacy native of Evanston, Illinois, and a proud descendant of Haitians and rural Black and Indigenous North Carolinians. Join me as we take time each month to dive into all things housing, including potential policies, community dreams, persistent systemic barriers. We'll also celebrate success and everything in between. We are so glad you're here. Welcome to Reclaiming Home, Housing Justice with Urban Homeworks. Today, I am joined by Andrea Jenkins, Ward 8 City Council member and City Council President. Andrea, I'd love for you to kick off our introductions by sharing your name, pronouns, job title, and how you ended up in justice work.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Andrea Jenkins. I am the Ward 8 City Council member in Minneapolis and also the president of the Minneapolis City Council. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm an artist, a writer, a poet, an educator. I've been advocating for trans and LGBTQIA plus rights for the past 30 plus years, as well as, really taking an intersectional approach to the work. So, I've been on the front lines of disability justice, of police reform, of climate change, economic justice, disability rights, women's rights. So, how did I come to justice work? I grew up in Chicago, Illinois during the 1960s, some of the most politically active times in recent history anyway. And that has really shaped my worldview. It was a moment in time when the Black arts movement was very prominent, and that concept was that, Black artists should be making work that really tries to uplift and liberate Black people. So that's kind of how I ended up in justice work.
Awesome. Thank you for that reminder of your history. And I think most of our audience knows by now, my name is Asale Sol. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the executive director of Urban Homeworks. And if you're new to Urban Homeworks, we are a 28-year-old nonprofit leading the fight for housing justice so that all people have a safe, stable, and dignified place to live. If you'd like to support this podcast because you've been listening to us for the last few months, please consider becoming a monthly donor at urbanhomeworks.org/donate-monthly. And thank you so much for joining us, those of you who are listening. And so we're here today to kind of talk about where we're at and what City Council is thinking for next moves on rent stabilization. So I'd love for you, Andrea, to just kind of share with us your experience regarding rent stabilization from that City Council perspective. How are you thinking about this today, and what has informed that thinking?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. St. Paul passed a pretty strict rent stabilization policy ordinance that limited rent increases to 3%, as well as no exemptions for new construction. I think no exemptions, period. And then subsequently had to revisit that ordinance and make some concessions, and I think they allowed landlords. I haven't been following it super closely, but I do think they allowed landlords to petition for rent increases over 3%, and
It's actually over 8%, which is pretty high, and it was higher than their city's average annual rent increase. It was actually quite high.
Yeah, so over 8%, but still over 3%, right? So way over 3%. And subsequently, many landlords did apply for that and were granted that. And so many people in St. Paul saw their rent increase beyond 3%. And as you stated, many over 8%, which kind of defeated the whole purpose of the ordinance. You know, I really think we need to have a really targeted rent stabilization policy in the city of Minneapolis. I think we need to combine it with some form of subsidy, rent subsidy for some of our most vulnerable people. And what really informed my thought process around this is, you know, in 2019, the city of Minneapolis commissioned a study from CURA, the Center for Urban Research. Can't remember what the A stands for, but and it was
Center
led by
for Urban and Regional Affairs.
Yeah, thank you. And it was led by Dr. Brittany Lewis, and it was pretty comprehensive. But really, what it talked about was that there are some very significant problems that are impacting low-income women of color that live in some pretty specific zip codes: 55411, 55412, and 55406. Primarily women of color, single moms, and those are the people that are being deeply impacted by these multinational companies that are buying up properties, and particularly single family homes, and renting them out, and really, you know, charging exorbitant rent increases to low income women. And so, given that information, I mean, the first time I saw the report, I'm like, wow, this is fascinating. Like, we really need to target resources and efforts to these very specific women who are experiencing these challenges. Not to say that we should not, I mean, we should definitely put a cap on how much large multinational conglomerate landlords, real estate conglomerates can charge And we need to be able to help really low-income women by subsidizing their rents. And one of the biggest problems that I hear from tenants as I talk to people, say Tool, Inclinitos, other folks that are really engaged in activism around these issues, is concerns about maintenance in these properties, that, they are having hard time with various lack of lack of maintenance, mold issues, broken appliances, leaky ceilings, plumbing, etc. And people are really, really concerned about um, the quality of the maintenance in their units. And so,
Absolutely. So, Andrea, I am gonna focus this a little bit. So, given that, I think, as we reflect on the history of this recent vote on June 28th and the vote in November 2021, I think it's just important to name that, Minneapolis is a predominantly renter city, so it's 53% renters. And as we talk about, I'd really love to hear you focus on what your views are and your solutions are. So you said that you really believe that we need to focus on those most likely to be taken advantage of by predatory landlords. And I couldn't disagree. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more that has to be a priority. But I also wonder what it means when 56% of the city says that they'd like to see the city council present a rent stabilization ordinance. And right now there's no path forward on that. So I guess I kind of have a couple of questions for you to focus us a little bit, which is one, like, what do you see as the solutions to predatory landlords that are preying on the populations that you described in a city that remains to be a predominantly renter city? And two, like, how does the city council see itself being held accountable for that November 21st vote? Where the majority, once again, of the city, 56%, said that they'd like to see a proposal on the table from the city council. So why don't we start with that latter question of just like, what comes next? So June 28th, we know what happened. The vote for a policy was denied. We had the 3 city council members who were out for Eid. And 2 of those city council members were trying to push forward that policy that the city, that all of Minneapolis constituents asked for, that the majority of Minneapolis constituents asked for. And now it kind of feels like we're in a limbo of no one really knows what happens next or how this moves forward. Are you able to give listeners any insight into that?
right. Well, thank you, Saleh. So I was really trying to focus that, and I think I was offering some of my solutions that I think are possible. But certainly, I mean, yeah, that's a different question. What comes next? So, unfortunately, that vote, I think it was June 28th. Yeah. Was not successful, though, I personally voted to keep that process moving forward. And, my colleagues, they determined that their religion or their observance of their religion was really important to them, and they took the day off to celebrate that. And that is certainly their choice and their right as United States citizens to do that. I think we do have a responsibility as elected officials to to show up and do our jobs that we were elected to do. But that was a choice that was made. What comes next, because that we waited, and I will say the council, but certainly you mentioned 2 council members, they brought forward this proposal at the very last moment that we could approve it to get it on the ballot, because there are some specific deadlines that we have to make in order to put a referendum or a ballot initiative on the ballot. And so we will have to come up with a ballot question policy proposal next year, and hopefully try to get that on the ballot so that the residents of Minneapolis can vote on that policy. We do live in a majority renter city. That's very true. We have all levels of rental units in Minneapolis, from the lowest of incomes to the highest of incomes. Mm-hmm. And, I would say that there are probably a large majority of people who don't have challenges paying their rent. And so I really want to focus, my goal is to focus on the people who do have challenges paying their rent. And I think the most marginalized people that I hear from that have problems is women of color living in the aforementioned zip codes that are 55411, 55412, North Minneapolis predominantly, as well as 55406, which is the Phillips community, Powderhorn, etc. And so, my approach would be to really target those rent cost burdened families first, as well as we need to continue to build more affordable housing. That's a part of the problem. And in Minneapolis, we've been able to, you work for Urban Homework, so we have been able to hold down the average rent increases to about 1 to 1.5% through housing production. But housing production alone is not going to get it done. That has to be a part of the solution. I think rent stabilization, some kind of cap on these predatory landlords has to be a part of the solution, and rent subsidies has to be a part of the solution. So that's my thought. And as you know, Asale, so we put together a work group to try to help us come up with a proposal that would be a compromise, if you will. And I get it. That's a dirty word in some circles, but it really, in a society, in a democratic society, not everybody can have their way. In fact, nobody can have their way. We have to try to come to some solutions where everybody can be in support of. That is the reality of living in a democratic society. Otherwise, we would call it an autocratic society, and somebody would make the decisions, and then we would all have to follow it.
Right.
So,
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that we
try to come up with We
Yeah, I
asked this
think
work group to try to come up with a
if I
policy
can just respond really quick, if I can just
that everybody
respond
could live with.
really quickly.
Yes, I will let you, if I can finish, and I hope then you please can respond, but I am talking. Um, we asked this work group and it came back with the exact same policy. So it put the onus back on the council, and we were not able to come up with a policy. We have to work on that and bring that back to the forefront in the 2023-24 cycle. Please
Okay.
respond.
So, in terms of, in terms of the point about compromise and an agreement, I mean, I think that, we are a republic, so we ask our elected officials to represent us as
Yeah.
constituents. And there was a very clear ask from the people to the council. And like you said, the council decided to sort of delegate that work out to a working group. And the working group came back with a proposal at 56%, which is a democratic process. It's not a split vote in any way. 56 is a solid majority. And so I think that, I just felt the need, and I apologize, but I just really felt the need to correct that it was a democratic process. And there was a 56%.
I didn't say it wasn't. I didn't say it wasn't.
There was a 56% majority. And so the other piece is that council member Chugtai and Osman did start to craft a policy based on the proposal from the working group. And so I think that, when we think about rent stabilization, it's also thinking about these processes, these democratic processes that we're trusting as citizens here in Minneapolis. Again, trusting our electeds to represent our asks, trusting that when the city puts together an advisory group or a working group, as in this case, and presents an ask to us and presents us with very specific expertise, as well as values the expertise that is in the room, that the city, as our electeds, will be responsive to that, not simply based on, the individual beliefs of the council members, but based on the asks of their constituents. And so, I think that it's just really important that we are talking about things like accurately. And so essentially, the city council, the majority of city council that day said that they didn't want to even send the drafted policy to committee, which would have left the door open for continued discussion and debate, right? It wasn't going to be a be all and end all just because from that stage it moved forward. It just meant, okay, we're doing the thing that folks asked us to do in November of 2021. And we're keeping this moving. We're keeping this on the table so that there is something for folks to vote on this year in 2023. And so I think that part of the question, part of the wondering is just around, where is, when I talk about like what's next, and you did answer that question, but I think folks are really wondering, what really happened there, where we had these layers of this democratic process, and essentially the people were silenced based on the response.
Well, I guess so. I mean, as you stated, we got to talk about it accurately, right? So if our 3 city council members had showed up, the policy would have passed. I voted for it.
Right.
So it would have passed. And the process would still continue. And it wasn't just that the work group came up with a recommendation. 56% of the work group decided that the same policy that was presented in St. Paul that had to be rescinded and revisited and reconstructed was the best policy to move forward. Even though when I was talking to some of the advocates, I mean, and even after the vote, people reached out and said, oh, that was just our strategy, but we really are open to some, again, here's this dirty word, compromise. That's what people literally told me, that they were open to compromise, but they wanted to move this strict policy forward to force a vote. And as you mentioned, we are sent to represent the community. And there has to be some level of research and data. Because if I did everything that everybody, all the 40,000 people wanted me to do in Ward 8, which I can tell you all 40,000 people have a different idea. They're not all on the same page. Some people might want transgender people to fall off the planet. And that's not a theory. That's what politicians are out here talking about. So I can't do every single thing that everybody wants to do. However, there are majorities, and we have to take that into consideration. We also have to take into consideration data. Our professional staff at the city of Minneapolis really, I mean, they did the research, the data, whether we agree with it or not. They said, wow, this 3% policy is probably, this policy that was brought forward is probably not the best policy to move forward. And even given that information, I personally said we should put something on the ballot. A lot of my other colleagues said, given that information, I don't think we should. And, I can't really explain their viewpoints, Asali, so I can only explain mine. And we are a 13-member body. We each have one vote. And, I can't force people to do things. And while we do live in a republic with representative government, I think this is the way I think representative government should work, is that you got to take all the data and then you got to make a decision.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that for a lot of folks, they felt that the city council would definitely do that, in addition to the recommendation from the working group. Just to go back to some data that I think is really important. So one of the things that people have pushed back on really hard with the framework that was presented from the working group at 56% is around new construction in particular. And one of the things that I found in relation to the St. Paul vote is that they that HUD did a study that showed I think to your point, a 48% decrease from 2021 to 2022 in building permits. But it was interesting that what the study actually showed was that this happened, this decrease began before the vote in November, and even I think a year before the policy. And so it's just, I think what's been fascinating to me is to see the different ways that data is being used. Kira also did a study. Kira also did a study that demonstrated that rent control policies don't lead to limits on new construction. And most recently, a group of economists wrote a paper to the federal government, actually saying that, the pushback against rent control policies are very reflective of historic pushback against raising the minimum wage. and that a lot of the theory behind that, the theory that says that we shouldn't do that, is based on these just archaic models of economics that don't reflect what's actually happening on the ground. And so again, recognizing where you stand, I think that, it's just important for folks who are listening to understand, like, how do we do this better? It's like, I think you and I agree that the folks that suffer when we can't figure out our processes are folks that look like you and I. They're folks that come from similar backgrounds as you and I. And so wanting to remove the barriers that we have in achieving housing justice and all the work that folks put into achieving that. And again, I know I keep going back to it, Andrea, but I'm like, technically people did they did the thing that our system asks us to do, right? They said
they voted.
Right, they did their part.
Yeah.
So now what?
So now
right?
we have to, now the elected officials have to respond and have to come up with some workable solution that is going to help minimize the burden on people's ability to pay rent. And certainly I read those studies. I think some form of rent control is necessary. And it's not like we don't have data on rent control. I mean, it's been happening in major cities across the United States for minimum 50 years. And I think even in New York City, a little bit longer than that. In some of the cities that it was initially implemented in, including New York, San Francisco, Northern California, Oakland, Sausalito, I think even Sacramento, all throughout the state of California, and other parts of the country. Washington, D.C. has rent stabilization. Those are literally some of the most expensive places in the whole country to live. New York City, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. And so rent stabilization alone hasn't solved the problem. And it's complex, Asale, so because, as you know, there are, I feel we're continuing to say multinational companies, but they're literally buying up these units and leaving them vacant.
That's right.
And here in Minneapolis, that's a little less of the case, but I would imagine there are some of these condos downtown. And I know they are, because we had to try a lot of these luxury buildings. They wanted to keep some apartments aside for Airbnb, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, to your point, in North Minneapolis, we know that we have several hundred properties that could be for affordable rent that are owned by, to your point, multinational companies.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was going to say, they don't, here in Minneapolis, there's not the whole vacancy problem. It's their homes are occupied, but they are charging exorbitant rents and really driving people out. So, as the Attorney General did crack down on these real estate investment firms, and try to make them do the right thing, I think that has to be a part of our strategy. It's in 2008, the whole housing market crashed because of nefarious bankers doing things. I mean, it was a worldwide crash. So it is it's hard, Sally, so to rein these companies in. I mean, they always find another way to exploit people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
And
loopholes in
so,
policies, right? They find the loopholes in the policies.
right, exactly. You know, and I mean, you know, there's a phrase about excuses, you know, and I don't want to make excuses, but this is, I mean, I don't know any of our societal problems that have really simple solutions to them. I just
No,
and
but we
I
do
work
know.
on trying to come up with solutions to a lot of these problems.
Absolutely.
Homelessness, public
Absolutely.
safety, uh, income inequality, climate change. And if there were simple solutions, we would have done them already and everything would be perfect.
I know you
But they're
don't really believe that. I know you don't really believe that, because humans always find a way to get in the way, even if it is simple, right? We know that there is a housing crisis. We know that, even in our beloved Minneapolis, that is beautiful and prosperous, that we have a growing tent encampment issue, a houselessness issue. And it has been proven that rent control saves costs for cities that are expending money on trying to figure out what to do with folks who cannot afford to live in those communities. Rent control has economic benefits, and I feel like that's not talked about enough. It prevents houselessness. It lowers evictions that are due to lack of rent payment. It avoids like this increased public expenditure on emergency rooms, on the criminal justice system, putting people in jails and in prisons, and the court systems. And so I hear that it's complicated. I think that it starts to feel complicated when we start to question, again, who we are prioritizing in our processes and in our votes. But ultimately, when we see nationally that there's a housing crisis, and locally, as much as we like to talk about all the great things about this city, locally there is a housing crisis, and a significant portion of our community is rent burdened, is paying more than 30% of their income on housing, which means they have no opportunity for thriving, that they are literally living day by day, that they are struggling. And so understanding what you stated earlier, in complete agreement with what you stated earlier about the reality that a lot of our renters make some of the highest salaries in the city. I 100% agree with you. The charge to the city council in November 2021 was the people saying, we want you to focus on those that are most likely to be disenfranchised by this housing injustice system. We want you to prioritize those that don't have the same access to growing their income and their wealth. We talk about home ownership so much in the city, and that is literally the work that we do here at Urban Homeworks, but we know that you cannot even consider owning, right, if you're not stable in rental housing. And so I just really hope that the members of city council that rejected moving this ballot measure forward, even again, to just continue the conversation so that the voters have something to respond to, and that our mayor, who came out pretty immediately to say that he would reject anything that limited rent increases to 3%, I just have to ask, who is being prioritized in statements like that and in decisions like that? And I hope that we really assess our priorities. Again,
I
those
think it's
priorities
a fair
that
question. I do
reflect
think it's a fair question.
city.
I think I've responded to that. I can only speak for myself, and
No,
not.
100%, 100%.
But I will say, I mean, the initial proposal, I mean, maybe the intention was to focus on the most vulnerable, but in actuality, the initial proposal and then the subsequent proposal that came out of the working group said 3% cap, no exclusions. So that means the people that live, I don't even know the names of these luxury apartment buildings, but that live across the street from the Mississippi River and next door to the Guthrie Theater, um, you know, their rents would be capped at 3% too. Um, and I'm not sure if they're the most cost burdened people in our city, in our fair city. Um, so, if that's what I'm trying to focus on is the most vulnerable people. And I get a lot of pushback from, I think, a lot of well-meaning people that say, well, it needs to be equality. And I'm saying, no, it's gotta be equity. Because if I do a 3% across the board, guess what? Those moms in North Minneapolis that I talked about and in Phillips neighborhood, they're in the same position. They can't pay the rent now. So if it's only a 3% increase, they're not going to be able to pay it then. Um, I personally am a landlord. I live in a duplex. My family has owned multifamily housing since the 1920s. That has, you know, my aunt Ella moved from Alabama to the inner city of Chicago and bought a house and made it into what they call like a tenement house. She chopped up all the rooms, and people were able to come from the South and, you know, have a place to live as they figured out employment, schools, housing, etc. Um, and that started a tradition in my family that, we weren't wealthy, we weren't real estate moguls, but almost everybody in my family had a multi-unit building. You grew up in Chicago, right?
That's right.
We call them 3 stories and 2 stories in Chicago. They call them duplexes and triplexes here in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
But my family, that's been our history all the way up till now. And I live in a duplex that I bought from my mother, who carried on that tradition. Um, it allows me to, and everybody that I've ever rented to has been a single woman, mostly single women with kids. Um, and I never, ever raised the rent on them until they moved out of the apartment. And then I raised the rent, you know, to try to keep up with inflation. And I got to tell you, every month my garbage bill goes up, my water bill goes up, my electricity bill goes up. Um, I've been owning this property for 24 years. I have never made a profit. I have to pay half of the mortgage every month because, and I think there are some people who do the same thing I do, but their rent from their unit actually pays the whole mortgage. That's not my reality. Um, and so I think that a lot of landlords, if we made a 3% cut, and that's a reality for a lot of small landlords, because guess what? I don't want to evict people. A, it costs money to evict people. And then B, I'm losing money every month that the apartment is vacant, and it takes time. So most landlords, most really small landlords, they don't raise the rent. They would rather have a good tenant
That's right.
than a lot of money.
That's right.
But if we instituted that ordinance, I will guarantee you that the majority of landlords would raise the rent 3% every month because they have to stay competitive with the market. That's literally what's happening in St. Paul. And not only the 3%, but also the 8%, 10% increases that landlords are asking for because inflation does continuously go up. So, I want to see rent stabilization. I want to see it targeted. 3% sounds like a great number to me. Um, I think we do have to have some kind of awareness for new construction, maybe less than 20 years that I know a lot of these developers ask for, maybe something like 10 years, but I mean, housing production is a data proven part of the strategy because we just don't have enough housing for everybody that wants to live in Minneapolis. Um, so that has to be a part of the strategy. And then subsidies has to be a part of it. And I think next year we're going to revisit this issue and we're going to bring a proposal for the residents of Minneapolis to vote on. Maybe in St. Paul, they went straight for the um, to let the council decide what the policy is. In Minneapolis, our charter requires us to put it on the ballot, and so I'm really hopeful and optimistic that we will get a policy on the ballot in 2024.
Awesome. Andrea, thank you so much for your time today. I know you've probably been talking a lot about rent stabilization lately, but it is a hot topic. It's a national topic, and it's great for us to dig into what does it mean to bring greater housing justice and stability to our lowest income neighbors. I want to end on vision. So before you go, and I know you got a time limit, so I'm really going to try to keep you on time.
Okay, thank you.
But I'd love to hear you just describe your vision for housing justice for Ward 8 in particular. It's an election year, so I know I'm giving you time to kind of let us hear your talking points on housing justice, and how you'd see that applied beyond Ward 8.
Sure. And, Asali, so yes, I am an elected official, but I really, honestly, and I don't know if people believe this or not, but I really try to make my decisions based on what is the right thing to do, not what is politically expedient. That said, I was a part of the very foundational conversations of the creation of urban homeworks. I was a part of I mean, and when I say a part of, I mean like sitting at the table talking to folks like David Rubador and PRG and all of these organizations that were in the formative stages of the City of Lakes Community Land Trust to help people own homes. My vision for the future of housing justice is that we have to close this gap of home ownership between Blacks and Caucasians in the city of Minneapolis. I think white people home ownership rate is around 75, 78%, and many Black Minneapolitans are around 25 to 27% homeownership. So we gotta close that gap. In addition, we have to build more multi-family unit housing. And I think, based on my own personal experience, that is a way to increase home ownership as well as increase opportunities for more people to live in in stable, well-maintained housing units, because typically when a landlord lives in the building, it's generally much more maintained.
Yes.
So filling in what's called the missing middle, those duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. We are trying to develop developers to be able to do that, developers of color who are out here doing this work and really making a difference. And so continue to support them and be creative about where those housing units can go. We passed the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which is probably one of the most comprehensive upzoning plans in the entire country. And really holding firm on that, because that gets a lot of pushback from a whole lot of wealthy people who don't want to see more density in the city of Minneapolis. Really holding the line on that and being creative. And also, in addition to holding the line on the 2040 plan, but really when it comes to implementing the 2040 plan, a lot of people are like, no, we don't want a 6-story unit on our block. We don't want to force. I got really good friends who won't even talk to me anymore because there's a 4-story unit going up on their block. And I'm like, no, you guys, we have to do this because this is how we're going to help to resolve this housing crisis that we are experiencing in Minneapolis. So continue to hold the line. Ward 8, we have deeply affordable housing units going up all across the ward. This has been, since I've been on the Minneapolis City Council 2018 to 2023, it has been the largest housing boom in Ward 8 since, I don't know, the early 1920s. We've built over 560 new units for building. The building permits are there to create 560 new units. I just had a conversation with a Black developer this past week who is going to build 84 units of senior housing along the Nicollet Avenue corridor at the old Burger King site that was dilapidated, graffiti ridden, and weeds growing up, are really an eyesore and a detriment to the community. To continue to support those kinds of efforts, but also create more opportunities for home ownership, and particularly for people of color. And I will say specifically for Black people. That is my vision.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Council President Jenkins. Really grateful for your time and your energy and passion on this topic. It's always fun to have a friendly rumble. So thank you for talking through those points with me. Quick reminder. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I really appreciate the opportunity to really be able to have a really nuanced conversation about this. Sometimes, you go into these community forums, etc., and they give you 3 minutes to answer a question like, how are you going to resolve, murders in the city? And it's like, yeah, I can't really answer that question in 3 minutes. So thank you for this extended opportunity to really get into the nuance of this really critical issue. Much
Absolutely.
appreciated.
Absolutely. Quick reminder to our listeners that there are city council elections Tuesday, November 7th. It's an election year, always an exciting time, and all 13 wards are up for vote. As Council President Jenkins stated earlier, Minneapolis uses ranked choice voting, which means you'll be able to rank up to 3 candidates for each office, and you'll have links in our show notes to find your ward number and additional voting information. Here at Urban Homeworks, we push everyone to get out and vote, regardless of who you vote for or how you vote. It's about showing up in this democratic process. This election will determine the makeup of the city council for the next 4 years. So it's very important. Really grateful for city council folks and electeds who are willing to show up and engage directly with the community. So again, thank you, Council President Jenkins. And with that, I'm gonna let you make it. See, I told you I would keep you on time. So I'm gonna let you get out of here and make it to your next appointment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's great to see you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much for tuning in for Reclaiming Home, Housing Justice with Urban Homeworks for today's discussion. If you like this podcast and want to support Urban Homeworks housing work, head over to www.urbanhomeworks.org/donate to make a gift, attend a future event, volunteer with us, or learn more. Until next time, remain connected and informed.